Przedstawię naszego drugiego wykładowcę dzisiejszego wieczoru, Christopher Bryan z Uniwersytetu w Bath w Anglii, psycholog, badacz stosunku konsumentów do mięsa hodowanego komórkowo i innych nowych rodzajów żywności. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I put my headphones on there to hear what you were saying about me. I want to make sure that you're not saying anything mean about me. Okay, thank you all for joining me here on your Saturday evening. I don't normally spend my Saturday evenings talking at rooms of so many people. At least when I do, I'm a lot drunker than I am now. So my research is about consumer perceptions of cultivated meat primarily. Now, in a moment, I'll talk about some of the reasons why we might want to move towards producing meat in cell cultures rather than by rearing animals. And what people think of that, what are some of the societal contexts that make this an important thing to be thinking about, and some of the challenges that we're hoping to overcome here. So first, let's talk about some of the problems with animal agriculture today. Firstly, when we think about greenhouse gas emissions, most of us are thinking about cars and planes, that kind of thing. Perhaps that we think that a good solution to cut down our greenhouse gas emissions would be moving towards electric vehicles. And certainly that is a good solution to cut down on some of our greenhouse gas emissions. But greenhouse gas emissions are coming from all different sectors. And in fact, there are more greenhouse gas emissions from rearing livestock than there are from all of the world's transport combined. So you take all of the cars, all of the lorries, all of the trains, and all of the planes that we have, and more greenhouse gas emissions come from cows' rear ends. This is, of course, a huge problem, and is something that people are increasingly aware of. The methane that comes from cows is several times more potent than the CO2 that we normally are worrying about from other sources. Animal agriculture is also a massive consumer of fresh water. So water in farming is mainly to do with watering the crops that we're then feeding to animals. In many parts of the world, like in Poland, where it is quite rainy, this might not be such a problem because a lot of the water that falls on crops is coming from rainwater. But in other parts of the world where there's less rain, the water to water crops to feed to animals is actually coming from irrigation. That's what they call blue water, which is water that we could have drunk, but actually we're using for other purposes. So globally, animal agriculture is estimated to be responsible for up to a third of freshwater consumption, which is a huge problem as well. Deforestation, this is a big one, again related to climate change. We're clearing out massive areas of forest in order to have more land to rear animals, and in particular to grow crops to feed to animals. A lot of the environmental problems, in fact, with animal agriculture come from the need to grow crops to feed to the animals. So when I'm talking about animal agriculture, I'm also talking about the related crop growing systems as well. Part of that comes from animals being up the trophic levels, which basically means that it's a lot more inefficient than if we were eating the plants directly. And relatedly, animal agriculture uses an immense amount of land around the world. Now, this is a problem because this land could be used for other more productive purposes. And I've mentioned deforestation, sorry. A related issue is reforestation. We're discovering now that it's incredibly important to have more land to actually reforest, and that this might be one of our best chances at combating climate change, is planting more trees. Of course, we need the space to do that, and currently, animal agriculture and related systems are taking up an awful lot of land and making that much more difficult to do than it would be. Animal agriculture is also the cause of a lot of disease pandemics. So when you hear about bird flu and swine flu and other related zoonotic diseases, Of course, these rely on having birds and having swine in order to spread the diseases. Part of this comes from the conditions that animals are kept in. Very cramped conditions, very dirty conditions, very conducive to developing diseases and passing them around. In fact, most of the fatal foodborne infections that we get come from animal products. Animal agriculture also contributes to antibiotic resistance. So we have these animals on these cramped, dirty conditions, they're getting sick, and as a preemptive measure, we give them loads of antibiotics, partly to stop them from getting sick, but also partly to encourage them to grow more quickly. So this is particularly an issue in animal farming in the States, where over 70% of the antibiotics sold are not being used in medicine for humans, they're being used in animal agriculture. And these types of antibiotics, which encourage animals to grow more quickly than they would naturally, are particularly bad when it comes to creating antibiotic-resistant diseases. Of course, antibiotic resistance is a huge issue and is up there with climate change as potentially an existential threat to our species. This is something that we really should be taking very seriously, and animal agriculture is something which is really accelerating this. And of course, we have a system now where we're having to kill billions and billions of animals every year because we want to eat them. There's no animal-hating villain who wants to create a system where we're killing loads of animals, although if there was, they'd have done a very good job of it. We keep these animals in terrible conditions, they're often mutilated, they're kept in small cages and not allowed to express their natural behaviors. They live pretty short, brutal, miserable lives just so that we can eat them. This has ended up with some really absurd outcomes. I'm from the UK, and one of the impacts of Brexit has been around the lamb industry. They're talking about, we export an awful lot of our lamb. Farmers in Wales in particular, this is a big industry. And we're now at a stage where those exports might be threatened depending on how Brexit goes, basically. And the government have recently said that they are considering guaranteeing to buy all of these lamb stocks so that the farmers don't lose out. And what that means is that they'll be paid to rear the lambs, and their lambs will be killed, and they'll never be eaten. There's going to be millions of these cute little animals that are just brought into the world, have terrible lives, and they're killed for no reason at all. This is madness. Nobody wanted this to happen. So those are some of the problems with animal agriculture. They affect lots of different areas that we should all care about. And next I'll talk about why nobody cares. Or more accurately, why we're able to carry on acting as if this doesn't matter. So this is some survey data from the UK. We asked 1,000 meat eaters for their opinions on veganism, different aspects of veganism. So you can see here that most people agree that veganism is good for the environment, around about 70%. Again, around about 70% agree that veganism is ethical. Real minorities here, around about 9% disagree with these statements, around about 20% undecided. Also, most people think that veganism is healthy. Again, a minority are disagreeing with this statement. So these are the main benefits that animal advocates are normally trying to sell veganism on. It's better for the environment, it's better for the animals, better for your health. We find that most people already agreed with these things. But who can guess what the bottom bars will look like? Do you think that when we're asking people whether they agree that veganism is tasty, convenient, affordable, who thinks that most people will agree with that? Who thinks that most people will disagree? Right. You're right. So big red bars here. Over 50% disagreeing that veganism is tasty. Over 50% disagreeing that it's affordable. And 3 out of 4 people disagreeing that veganism is convenient. So people are recognizing the benefits. People know that it's better for the environment. People recognize that it might be healthy, and people are saying that it's an ethical choice to make. But the point is, it's a big sacrifice for them personally. And we know that, unfortunately, these three things, which are the major things that people disagree with about veganism, are actually also the major determinants of food choice. These three things actually make up almost all of our food choices. Do I like the taste of this food? Is it convenient for me to get? Is it cheap enough? That's pretty much, health is another one that some people consider, but these three things are mainly the major constituents of all food choices. So it represents a massive personal sacrifice, is the point that I'm making here. Most of us think that we start out with our beliefs, and then based on those beliefs, decide what to do. So we go from our beliefs to our actions, and our actions are informed by our beliefs. But it turns out that that's only half the story. So in an experimental study, people were asked how likely they think it is that animals can feel pain. Now, half of these people, before answering this question, were given some nuts to snack on. And the other half were given some beef jerky to snack on. The people who were given the beef jerky to snack on before answering this question rated animals as significantly less likely as being able to feel pain. Now, they didn't choose what to eat in this experiment. They were randomly allocated. They could have had the nuts. They could have had the beef jerky. So that wasn't reflecting their beliefs. Rather, their beliefs were reflecting their actions. So we have beliefs do affect your actions, yes, but equally actions affect your beliefs. And the reality is that for most people, eating meat is just the default. You're brought up eating meat, your parents ate meat, it's just normal, right? Everybody does it. And rather than ever having thought about, should I be doing this, you just did it, and then from that, arrived at a set of beliefs which perhaps now you feel obliged to defend in order to be consistent with your actions. So it's not necessarily that beliefs are informing your actions, actions are also informing your beliefs, and that's how many of us have ended up in the situation that we have with regards to meat consumption and our beliefs about animals. So there's also status quo bias. This is a really interesting thing. Great example of this is with regards to organ donation. So when people die, you have a choice to make. You can either say that you are happy to donate your organs to other people who need them, who are waiting for surgeries. Or you can say, oh, I'd rather not do that. I think my organs are mine, and even though I'm dead and I don't need them anymore, I'm going to hang on to them just in case. In Germany, just 12% of people are organ donors. So 88% of people are not organ donors. And right next door, you have Austria, very similar culturally. A lot in common. But here you have almost 100% of people organ donors. Almost nobody is not an organ donor. Does anybody know why this happens? The defaults, yeah, a couple of people said it here. So this has actually been a debate in public health in recent decades. Some countries have an opt-in organ donation system, and that includes Germany. So if you want to be an organ donor in Germany, you have to go on to some website or something, I guess, and sign up and say, I'm going to be an organ donor, and they'll send you a card. In other countries, including Austria, they have an opt-out system. So that's where they say, by default, when you die, your organs will be donated, and if you don't want that to happen, you actually have to go opt-out. And what these two charts show us is that the overwhelming majority of people are just sticking with the defaults. So with these choices, it's not that people have a strong preference as to what happens to their organs after they die, but they just can't be bothered to change from the default, basically. So we're probably in a similar situation with regards to meat production today. And when we talk about alternative forms of meat production, including cultivated meat, a lot of people feel an instinct to kind of defend how things are today. And they say, well, if we were to move from a system of rearing animals to a system of cultivated meat production, there might be some bad effects of that. It's unnatural, perhaps some farmers will lose their jobs, and other things like that. You know, there are some good reasons reasons against that to discuss, for sure. But if you were to reorient this and say the move was the other way, imagine that today we had a system where all of our meat production is in vitro. We're producing cultivated meat. And were to give some of those same reasons as reasons to stop doing this and instead start rearing animals. If I was to say, how about we stop cultivating meat and we start rearing a load of animals instead? Now, it'll be really terrible for the environment and we'll have to kill a load of animals, but we might make some jobs for farmers. Suddenly, that seems like a stupid idea, right? Again, this is an indication that basically we just have a preference for the way things are. This is status quo bias, in exactly the same way that you have the opt-in, opt-out with regards to organ donation. People are inclined to stick with the way things are. So we got this little chicken here. His name's Bill. He's grown too large. He can't walk. He can't stand up. He had his beak chopped off. He's got all sorts of horrible diseases. Do we feel some sort of sadness for Bill? Anyone feel a little bit like we wish Bill wasn't in that bad situation? A few people. What if I show you this? Suddenly it's a lot harder to care, in a weird way. When you're just talking about one animal, we can connect with that on an emotional level and say, this is a bad thing, this one animal's suffering. But we're not talking about one animal, we're talking about billions. And here, even when we're talking about the tens of thousands of animals in this warehouse, it's a lot harder to scale that feeling of moral outrage. It's actually a case of our brains, the part of our brains which deals with emotive issues, including empathy for injured animals, for example, is a different part of our brain from the part that scales to large numbers. And a result of that is we just fail to adequately apply those emotive reasons to large numbers of animals. So at the start, when I said we're killing billions of animals every year, it's kind of like, well, what does a billion animals look like? I can't imagine that. I can't connect with that. When you're talking about a single animal, you have the single identifiable victim effect, where you can connect much more emotionally, you can understand why this might be a bad thing. But as soon as we're talking about massive scales of animals, it's a lot harder to care, basically. And this has been shown experimentally in this study about wild birds affected by an oil spill. People were asked how much money they would be willing to donate to save a certain number of birds. And people were asked either how much would they donate to save 200 birds, or to save 2,000 birds, or to save 20,000 birds. So a fact, order of magnitude each time. Were people willing to donate 10 times more to save 10 times as many birds? Who thinks that they were willing to donate 10 times more? Nobody? Yeah, you're right. The amount was exactly the same, regardless of the amount of birds that they were told they were going to save. There was no difference in the amount that people said they were going to donate. So this illustrates what we call scope insensitivity. It's genuinely very difficult to scale an emotional response to the numbers of animals involved. So for that reason, when I tell you that we kill over 50 billion animals a year, the emotional response is really no different to if I say we kill 5,000 animals a year. It's really not. It should be, orders of magnitude more outrageous, but it's difficult to scale that emotion that way. So here are the few things I've mentioned. Cognitive dissonance and motivated reasoning, where our actions are actually informing our beliefs rather than the other way around. Status quo bias, where we have a preference for the way things are rather than the way things could be. We stick to the defaults. And scope insensitivity, where we fail to scale our emotions that might be driving our decisions. These are some of the psychological mechanisms involved, and the reason why it's basically quite hard to care about all of these negative impacts of industrial animal agriculture. It really is difficult. It really is. So we can look at, we saw that a lot of people agree that following a vegan diet would be healthy and good for the environment and better for animals, more ethical, but that they don't want to make the personal sacrifices in terms of taste and convenience and affordability. So let's have a look at some of the alternative products. A good way of addressing this is to make good quality alternative products. If we can say to consumers, you don't need to make those sacrifices, you can maintain the same level of tastiness and convenience and affordability and not have any of the bad side effects, perhaps we would be telling a different story. Now, as I said at the start, most of my work is about cultivated meat. This is meat from animal cells, real animal meat. We're not talking about plant-based replacements here, with none of those bad side effects. Okay, it's orders of magnitude better for the environment. It avoids all of the animal suffering. And we can actually tailor these products to be better for our health as well, which I'll talk more about in a moment. So this is Hurricane Harvey, which about 2 years ago drove through large parts of the south of the United States, caused billions of dollars of damage, and really shook the world. In the ensuing panic, people didn't really know if they were going to be able to get food. So everybody rushed to the supermarkets, and you saw these images of empty supermarket shelves where food was completely sold out. This is a picture of the vegan section in a supermarket at that time. This is a real picture of a supermarket in Texas during Hurricane Harvey. So what's that telling us? The vegan alternatives that we have at the moment, people just don't want them for the most part. We need to look at other options. We need to look at being able to recreate the foods that people want to eat and just mitigate some of the bad factors of them. But as you might expect, it's not quite that straightforward. So when it comes to cultivated meat, many consumers are a little bit uncomfortable with the prospect. It's an unfamiliar thing, it's a new thing, people have questions about it. So my job is to look at how people feel about cultivated meat, what their objections are, what they see as benefits, and whether we can move that needle of acceptance. So here we've got a bunch of survey data looking at asking people whether they would eat cultivated meat. It's in a bunch of different countries and with sort of slightly differently phrased questions. You can see the proportion of people in green who said that they would eat it, the proportion of people in red who said that they wouldn't eat it, and the proportion in yellow who were kind of undecided. So the one thing that we noticed straight away is there's massive variation between these, right? So some of the most pessimistic saying that only 16% of people would eat it, and some of the most optimistic say around about 2/3 of people would be willing to eat it. So big variation. And what that tells me is that we can get real different measures of willingness to eat cultured meat depending how we describe it, depending how we talk about it, depending on the name we use as well. So there's an opportunity to develop ways of talking about cultivated meat which make it more appealing to people. And although these survey data vary quite a lot, we do see some pretty consistent demographic trends. So we see the following groups of consumers actually have higher acceptance. Men are more likely than women to say that they would eat cultivated meat. It's an interesting finding, probably related to perceptions of food safety. This may be a good thing because men eat a lot more meat than women, and a lot of the value in moving to cultivated meat comes from displacing demand for conventional meat. So it's a good thing that we're developing a product which is more appealing to men who, in general, eat about 50% more meat than women. Younger people are also more likely to say that they would eat cultivated meat. Again, this is unsurprising. This is something that we see with lots of things. Younger people are generally more open to new products, new experiences, whereas older consumers might be more likely to stick with what they're used to. Left-leaning people, I'm talking about politically here, not like this. People on the left are more likely to say that they would eat cultivated meat. That's most likely because they're already concerned about the environment and animal welfare to a lesser extent. It fits with their values a little bit more than conservative people. Conservative people also, similarly to older people, are more likely to stick with what they know. That's part of conservatism. And omnivores, this is really important. Cultivated meat is often spoken about as something that could be a way for vegetarians to be able to eat meat. That's not really the point of it. Again, the point is that we want to be able to displace demand for conventional meat. So when we're talking about all of the bad impacts of animal agriculture, of course, the point is here that we want to lessen those impacts by getting people onto cultivated meat instead. So it's really a great thing that this is something that's more appealing to omnivores overall. It's not so appealing to vegetarians and vegans. Most vegetarians and vegans are not really interested in eating cultivated meat. We think that's because after some time, vegetarians tend to develop a disgust reaction to meat, so like an emotional reaction that actually becomes separated from the reasons why they might have originally changed their diet. And that means that they don't find cultivated meat appealing, even if it didn't come from an animal. And people in urban areas, finally, more accepting of cultivated meat than people in rural areas. People in rural areas more likely to be connected to the countryside. Perhaps they're even working in farming jobs or know people who are. Now, this is actually some original research done by Rosalind Jenny and done for this festival in Poland. So here we can see around about 50% of people in this particular survey in Poland said that they would eat cultivated meat. Around about 22% said that they wouldn't, and around about 28% said they don't know. And again, we see the familiar consumer trends that we see in other data elsewhere. Younger people, men, more likely to say they would eat it. Urban consumers, and also more educated consumers as well. So that is the latest data that we have from Poland. We can compare this to this quite old data. This is about 15 years old, done in a bunch of different countries in Europe. We can see that Poland is kind of towards the bottom here. Importantly, for the next comparison, when you take note that the United Kingdom was one of the more accepting countries in the United Kingdom, in Europe, sorry. Now again, this data is not necessarily reflective of how European consumers feel today. This is about 15 years old, but it's important to be making these comparisons when we're looking at consumers around the world. So whilst the United Kingdom is one of the more accepting countries in Europe when it comes to cultivated meat, we're actually much less accepting than consumers in the US. Many of the cultivated meat companies are in the US, and it's thought that it's going to be quicker to market in the US compared to Europe. It's also possible that American consumers are a little bit less connected to kind of traditional ideas of agriculture and the countryside and the farming livelihoods and so on. They have more industrialized animal agriculture than we have in Europe already. So perhaps they're a little bit less connected to that. So whilst consumers in the States are more accepting than consumers in Europe, we actually see more acceptance again from consumers in China and India. This is a study that we did last year, and this is really important because these consumers in China and India are the people who are going to be creating a lot of the new demand for meat over the next number of years. We're seeing this is a really important thing because we're seeing now as millions rise out of poverty in India and China, it's likely that they're going to start demanding more meat. At the moment, per capita meat consumption in China and India is relatively low, but that's not going to be the case as more people get better off in these countries. They're going to be driving a lot of the increase in demand for meat. It's going to be around about a 70% increase in demand for meat by 2050, according to some predictions. And a lot of that is driven from the developing world. Now again, more good news here. Whilst China, so we had the UK amongst the most accepting in Europe, we had the US more accepting than the UK, we had China and India more accepting than the US, and here we have China amongst the least accepting in Asia. So Asia is going to be a really important market for cultivated meat. Now, the reason why we need to think about this in a global way, it's, you know, most of us have some sort of inclination to think about our home market as kind of the most important thing, right? But animal agriculture around the world is contributing to these problems. And animal welfare may even be much worse in some parts of the world than it is in Europe. Of course, animal agriculture is contributing everywhere to the problems, to the environmental problems that I mentioned. And particularly in Asia, they have a lot of these zoonotic disease outbreaks, swine flu and so on. They have a big outbreak of that going on at the moment, in fact. Another reason why this is important is Singapore in particular is going to be a market which is really important for cultivated meat, and that's because they're hugely reliant on food imports at the moment. So Singapore's a small little island, they have very little of any kind of fertile farmland, and they import an enormous amount of their food currently. For that reason, they're very interested in food technology. They want to lessen their dependence on food imports, and cultivated meat is one of many technologies that will enable them to produce more of their food themselves. So let's have a look at some of the benefits that consumers talk about when it comes to cultivated meat. The first and the most obvious is that it will be kinder to animals. So this is something that is kind of obvious by the nature of it. This is an alternative to killing animals, so that's something that people get right away. Another one is that it could be better for the environment. People are increasingly aware that animal agriculture has negative environmental impacts, and in particular, this is the case with regards to greenhouse gas emissions. People recognize that this could be an advancement in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. People also imagine that cultured meat could help to feed the world. They imagine that in the long term, this is going to be a way that we can produce meat more cheaply, and therefore provide meat to people who can't afford it currently. Now that's true, and in the long term it may be cheaper, but initially it's very likely that it's actually going to be more expensive than conventional meat. However, it is still probably going to have benefits for global food security, and again this relates to resource efficiency. So, as I've mentioned a couple of times, one of the major impacts of industrial animal agriculture is having to grow all of these crops to feed to animals so that we can eat the animals. One effect of that is that it drives up the price of those crops. When you are buying beef, you're also buying all of the crops that were fed to that cow, driving up the price of those crops. Many of those crops are staples in poorer parts of the world. And cultivated meat could be a way around that. And lastly, because almost nobody intuits that this could be a benefit of cultivated meat, is that it could increase food safety. And primarily people imagine that this is a way of avoiding those zoonotic diseases, swine flu and bird flu, mad cow disease and so on. So these are the benefits that people imagine might come from cultivated meat. And we have some experimental data that shows us what are going to be the most important ones to focus on when we're speaking about cultivated meat to consumers. So here you can see the proportion of consumers who said that they would eat cultivated meat before and after reading one of these three interventions. So consumers who read about the potential health benefits saw the largest increase in acceptance. There was some increase for the consumers who read about environmental benefits, and for the consumers who read about ethical benefits, including to animals, actually slightly fewer of them said that they would eat cultivated meat than before reading the intervention. So that tells us that basically banging on about animal ethics might not be the best way to sell this. Now let's look at some of the objections. What are the barriers to acceptance? What are the things that people are wary about with regards to cultivated meat? Well, first, a lot of people think that it will cost too much. If people have heard of cultivated meat, and most people haven't, they've probably read one of these articles with the $300,000 burger headline. Has anyone read that? Who's read about the $300,000 burger? Yeah. So this was kind of a misleading figure. That was basically the cost of all of the research up until that point. This wasn't kind of the marginal cost for an extra burger. This is what that entire research project cost, and of course there's never a price that would be expected to be paid for a burger by consumers. Some people also think that it won't taste as good. People think that it will be inferior tasting to conventional meat or possibly have a worse texture as well. So sensory qualities, people are imagining that cultivated meat as opposed to meat from animals basically won't be as pleasant to eat. It's unnatural. This is a big objection that people have. This is a strange one. I think this is something that you've spoken about on some of the panels at this conference already. There's a big thing around food and naturalness. People imagine that basically what's natural is good and what's unnatural is bad. It's not actually clear when you get into it what we really mean by natural in this context. But in any case, this is what's called the naturalistic fallacy, the idea that natural equals good, unnatural equals bad. And if you think about that proposition for a moment, it's quite clear that it doesn't make a lot of sense. There's loads of unnatural things which are really good for the world, like modern medicine. And equally, there's loads of natural things which are bad, like earthquakes. So there's not really necessarily anything to base that on. This is called the naturalistic fallacy. But closely linked to that are concerns about food safety. So this is one of the things that people think with regards to naturalness, because it's unnatural, therefore it's going to be unsafe. As I mentioned already, this could actually be a food safety technology in many ways to increase food safety. And one of the reasons for that is because the bar of conventional animal agriculture is pretty low. We already have a system where the animals are getting sick, they're passing those sicknesses on to us. We're giving them antibiotics, they're creating antibiotic-resistant pathogens that are affecting us. So here we can see some survey data where we can see kind of the relative prevalence of these different concerns. This is from the UK. Again, the top 3 concerns here, the most common, are all to do with food safety and naturalness. And then you can see slightly fewer consumers talking about the taste, the look, and the smell, and it being more expensive than conventional meat as well. So that's an overview of some of the perceived benefits and some of the barriers that stop people saying that they would consider eating cultivated meat. Well, how can we increase the proportion of people who are willing to eat it? Over the years, the nomenclature, the names that we use to refer to cultivated meat have changed. And these have a bearing on consumer acceptance. So when it first started out, and there was only really scientists interested in this, using the technical term in vitro meat. This is, somebody decided that this might not be the most appealing name to have on a restaurant menu. And so there was a move away from the name in vitro meat, and somebody came up with the term cultured meat, which sounds like that's a cultured guy, you know? It's a bit sexy, it's a bit French. Cultured meat was pretty good. From there, we thought we can do better than that again, and the industry started to adopt the term clean meat. Now, this was mainly to underline those environmental benefits that I spoke about. It's like analogous to clean energy. And would also highlight that it's actually literally cleaner, so it's free of all of the pathogens and bacteria and so on that you'll find in conventional meat. However, the industry has changed in the sense that it has actually gathered more interest from the conventional animal agriculture industry in a positive way. So from the early days, we were kind of nervous about taking on conventional animal agriculture and what might they say about us and so on. But actually, people within the industry kind of formed the strategy of inviting existing players into the cultivated meat industry. And now, many of the biggest companies in the conventional meat industry actually own stock in cultivated meat companies. And from our perspective, this is a great thing, because we don't want to end up in a situation where it's this tiny cultivated meat industry versus the massive animal agriculture industry. Far better to have them having bought in and be with us rather than against us. However, one effect of that is that they're saying, well, we're not really that comfortable with the term clean meat, because that's kind of implying that conventional meat is dirty, and that's not something that some of the stakeholders are happy with. Also, some consumer research has shown that clean meat is kind of seen as a marketing term, and is perhaps not that transparent. So a bigger priority now has been on transparency and not trying to mislead consumers. So last year, the industry moved from the term clean meat towards the term cell-based meat. Now, I was never really a big fan of the term cell-based, partly because it kind of underlines many of these unnaturalness concerns that we know consumers have, and partly because it's a little bit redundant. All meat is made of cells, so what's cell-based meat, really? And more recently, they've moved towards the term cultivated meat. And this seems like it ticks all of those boxes in terms of the criteria. It's fairly appealing to consumers, it's not misleading, it's fairly transparent what we're talking about, and it keeps all of the relevant stakeholders happy. So this has been kind of the evolution of nomenclature in the industry. And down here we have a bunch of names which we hope don't get used, but sometimes do get used by the media. This includes test tube meat, lab-grown meat, artificial meat, and so on. So these are the important terms that are important to avoid, that are really kind of non-consumer friendly. So the way that we talk about cultivated meat matters as well. In this experiment, we set up these 3 different frames where we were going to focus on certain aspects of the technology. In one condition, we were focusing on the societal benefits, saying that clean meat has many benefits for society, reducing harm to the environment and helping animals. In another, this is, if you've read any articles about cultivated meat, you've probably seen this kind of imagery used. Here we're saying clean meat's made in a highly advanced technology, using highly advanced technology in the state-of-the-art lab. And in the third condition, we were focusing on the similarity to conventional meat, saying this is basically the same as the meat you're already used to eating. It tastes like conventional meat, is increasingly affordable and can be healthier to eat. So, unsurprisingly, the middle of these resulted in lower acceptance than the other 2. And this is kind of a problem because, as I say, that kind of imagery with the Petri dish and the meat is something that's quite commonly seen in media coverage of cultivated meat today, but that's actually not ideal from a consumer acceptance perspective. We have data from elsewhere that kind of tells the same story. Here, this compared technical and non-technical descriptions of cultivated meat. And you can see that the technical descriptions in blue always resulted in lower consumer acceptance across these measures. There's been some other lessons about the way we talk about cultivated meat from looking at other industries. So there's a charity called the Sentience Institute, and they've looked at the GMOs, the GMO industry, the biofuels industry, and nuclear power as examples of how not to talk about technological innovations. And they've come up with a few lessons that are going to be applicable to talking about cultivated meat. The first of these is to focus on the positive aspects rather than giving very detailed responses to the negative aspects. The thinking here is that when you spend a lot of time responding to the negative aspects, you basically make that conversation louder. And what you're saying about it is not necessarily as relevant as the fact that that's one of the major conversations being had around the technology. As related to the second point, which they took a lesson from nuclear power, which was that technical explanations about safety might backfire. Again, it's the same kind of a reason here. It's unlikely that these technical explanations are going to be understood, and in fact, they might be taken out of context and used as ways of portraying the lack of safety of these kind of products. And finally, don't overpromise on the product or the timeline. So there's a real problem of hype around some of these new technological innovations, and we're saying it can kind of save the world, and we're going to have these products next week. We're not going to have these products next week, and there are real drawbacks of speaking about it that way. There are these hype cycles where some hype will basically drive a lot of investment into the area, but then if companies are kind of failing to deliver on the timelines and products that they're promising, it actually can cause what they call like an investment winter, where for a long time there's no interest in these products, and it actually ends up hurting the industry in the long run, setting the industry back. So that's some of my insights from my research about consumer acceptance of cultivated meat and how we talk about it. And now I want to talk about some of the societal context here and how this is going to fit in with other aspects of society. So this is a really interesting graph. This is from a few different surveys that shows acceptance of cultivated meat broken down by familiarity with the product. So here we can see low, medium, or high familiar consumers in blue, red, and yellow. And as with many other things, people who are more familiar with the concept are more accepting of it. This is good news for us because we're still in a place today where most people haven't heard of cultivated meat. So this tells us that in the future, as more people know about it, perhaps more people will be more likely to say they'll eat it. So this is related to media coverage of cultivated meat, and perhaps basically more media coverage is a good thing. More people will find out about it, and the more people know about it, the more likely those people will be to say they will eat it. But of course, the quality of the media coverage matters as well, and as I showed before with the 3 different framings, the way that we talk about it matters. There have been a couple of analyses of the media coverage around cultivated meat already. They're all a little outdated now, and there's been a lot happened since then. But I'll go over some of the findings nonetheless. Pardon me. So one study found that there's been generally positive coverage of cultivated meat. This is taken from sources in the US and Europe. And it's thought that that's because basically the sources were all from kind of pro-cultivated meat sources. So if you want to know about this kind of stuff at the moment, the people that they're going to talk to about it are researchers in the area, some of the non-profits in the area, and animal advocacy groups as well, which are all groups that are obviously in favor of cultivated meat. However, on the other side, there's been an analysis of some of the Australian media coverage, and they really found a prevalence of this focus on the unnaturalness part, and some criticisms that this was basically furthering a reliance on technological solutions, which we should be looking elsewhere for solutions to these problems. So kind of mixed media coverage. And as I showed you in the previous slide, a technological framing, which is very common that we see here, is linked to lower consumer acceptance measures. So increasing media coverage of cultivated meat, possibly a good thing as it becomes, people become more familiar with it, but also the quality of that media coverage matters. Now, one interesting area is how this is going to interact with religions. And many of the world's major religions have specific prescriptions around how people should eat meat, what types of meat people should eat. We actually have some survey data that gives some insights on this. So Islam is perhaps the most significant. This is one of the biggest religions in the world with the most adherents and has specific rules around meat consumption. So there's kind of 2 issues here. First is, will cultivated meat be able to be halal? So will cultivated meat in general be acceptable for Muslims to eat? And the second, and perhaps more interesting, is will we be able to produce meat from species which are normally banned in these religions? So pork is the big one in Islam and in Judaism as well. So there's been one paper which really dug into the Islamic law with respect to cultivated meat, and they basically concluded that it could be considered to be halal if the cells are taken from an animal which subsequently is halal slaughtered, and also the culture medium doesn't use animal blood, which most of the companies are saying that they won't do. Here we can see the proportion of Muslims in this particular survey who ate each of these type of meat in blue, and in red, the proportion who said that they would eat cultivated meat from that species. So we can see around about 70% of them ate beef, around about 75% ate poultry, Actually, surprisingly, around about 30% of them ate pork, even though they shouldn't. Basically slightly less in all of these categories, saying that they would eat cultivated meat. Kind of to be expected and in line with most consumers' comparisons of what they eat today and what they say they would eat cultivated meat. But the point here is that they're not zero, right? So most Muslims are tending to agree with this analysis that cultivated meat could in practice be halal. Next, we looked at Judaism as well. We had a far smaller sample for this. You might notice there's only 23 of them in our survey of about 3,000. And again, the same issues here. Will cultured meat be kosher? And will Jewish people be able to have kosher bacon, which is the thing that many of my Jewish friends are excited about. Here again, you can see lower lower intention to eat cultivated meat compared to the meat that they're eating at the moment, with the exception of pork. So it seems, again, we have like 60% of the Jewish people in this sample saying they were eating pork, so perhaps it's not as big an issue as some of my friends think. But interestingly, this is the only one in which the rate of saying they would eat cultivated meat is actually not lower than the meat that they currently eat. And again, most Jewish scholars seem to agree that cultivated meat could in practice be kosher. And finally, Hinduism. So one of the principles of Hinduism is called ahimsa, which is the principle of non-violence, and many Hindus interpret that as requiring vegetarianism. We actually found, again, that a majority of people calling themselves Hindus in our sample were eating meat. And interestingly, this is the one religion in which more people said that they would eat cultivated meat than currently ate meat from animals. So this was an interesting insight as well, in a religion which many of them, well, here we have beef is particularly relevant in Hinduism. They consider cows to be holy. Yeah, across all different types of meat, we can see basically higher intentions to eat cultivated meat than people were currently eating meat. I'll do a little bit on regulations, but I won't do too much. It's quite boring and it's quite late on a Saturday. But basically, the story in Europe is that this is going to fall under what's called the novel foods regulations. One of the requirements of that is that they need to be clearly labeled, so that's one of the reasons why it's perhaps a good thing that we've moved away from the term clean meat. This is authorized by the European Food Safety Authority, and it's likely that there will be kind of a long process of requiring lots of evidence around the nutrition of cultivated meat and also the safety. In the US, it's a slightly different story, a little bit less straightforward. There's been a little bit of a battle, basically, between these two regulatory agencies about who's going to regulate cultivated meat. And ultimately, they've decided that they're going to pretty much share jurisdiction of them. There may also be additional state regulations as well. The definition of meat is a real issue in both of these contexts. So it may not be included in the existing definitions of meat in both of these regulatory frameworks, which has implications for how it's going to be regulated and how it's allowed to be marketed. It's possible that this is going to change and that the definition of meat is going to expand to include cultivated meat. One of the major things here is food allergies. So as with plant-based meat, where you see a lot of conventional meat producers saying, we don't want these companies to be able to use meaty terms because they're trying to protect their industry, this is likely to happen also with cultivated meat. But the key thing with cultivated meat is that it is actually the same if you look at it under a microscope. And therefore, people with meat allergies need to be told that this is what you're eating. It's going to be precious little comfort to someone who's allergic to fish if they eat some cultivated fish after some bureaucrat has assured them that it's not fish and die. So the last thing that I'll talk about, and then we'll take some questions, is the potential impact on employment. So I've mentioned this a couple of times. Are the farmers going to lose their jobs? Employment in agriculture is around about 4.5% in the EU, but it's much higher than that in less developed countries. It's also concentrated in rural areas, and people working in farming tend to have lower education than average. So is possibly a problem. That if we do move to a phase where we are moving beyond animal farming, people who are doing animal farming at the moment might lose their jobs. Now, that is a real problem. It is worth worrying about. But it's also not something that can allow us to be stuck with what we're doing at the moment. Again, this is related to status quo bias, like I spoke about before. If you look throughout history, there's thousands of examples of jobs which became obsolete when technology moved on. My favorite example of this is a job called a knocker-upper. Anybody heard of a knocker-upper? No, I didn't think so. There are very few working knocker-uppers now. A knocker-upper was somebody who came around the streets with a big stick and knocked on your window to wake you up in the morning. What technology killed that job? Alarm clocks. Raise your hand who would vote for banning alarm clocks in order to bring back jobs for the knocker-uppers. Oh, we got a couple up there. All right. Got some knocker-upper sympathizers up there. Your dad was a knocker-upper, was he? This is just one example of jobs which don't exist anymore because technology made them unfeasible. We can't be stuck in a position where we're insisting that there have to be as many jobs as there are now just because. I'll end with this on that point. There's a story of an economist who went to visit a quarry in a country with a planned economy. And he went there and he noticed that there was no machinery anywhere. They just had 1,000 guys with shovels digging this quarry. And he came and he said to the foreman, how come you're not using any machinery? You just have 1,000 guys with shovels. And the foreman says to him, well, this way we create more jobs. And the economist said, oh, I thought you wanted to make a quarry. If it's jobs you wanted, you should take away their shovels and have 10,000 guys with teaspoons. We could apply the same thing in animal agriculture, right? I know how to create more farming jobs tomorrow. We could ban combine harvesters. We need way more farmers if we ban combine harvesters, but nobody thinks that that's a good idea. So there we go. I've spoken a bit about some of the problems with animal agriculture, why it's difficult to care about them, how people feel about cultivated meat as an alternative, and how cultivated meat interacts with some aspects of society as well. So I'll take a few questions now, but thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Pytania można zadawać po angielsku i po polsku. Czy mamy już kogoś, kto ma pytanie?
Ja chciałabym zapytać o etyczne aspekty tego mięsa z hodowli komórkowej, a mianowicie pan mówił, że pan nie je niczego, co ma oczy i czy pan jadłby takie mięso? Nie mówię teraz o smaku i awersji, tylko o samym etycznym aspekcie, a jeżeli nie, to dlaczego nie?
Yes, yeah, I did say that. That was rather flippant of me, really, wasn't it? Yes, I would eat cultivated meat. I think that the key thing is that it hasn't required an animal to suffer in order to make it. Now, there are some kind of ethical concerns around early iterations of cultivated meat because obviously you have to get the cells from somewhere, so the cells have come from an animal initially. And in fact, some of the early iterations have been grown in the culture medium of fetal bovine serum, which is what you get if you empty out a pregnant cow. I hope you haven't eaten already. So that's obviously an issue, but it's something that the industry as a whole has said it would be pointless if we were requiring that to be an ingredient on an ongoing basis. And so it's likely that in the future they will be moving past that. And in fact, all of the companies have said that they will be moving past that to be using different culture mediums. So it's likely that cultivated meat products in the future really will be animal-free. The marginal number of animals really will be zero. And at that stage, yes, I'm very excited to eat meat again, because like everybody else, I know that it's very tasty and nutritious and so on. Any others?
Ja mam dwa pytania o technologię. Pierwsze pytanie to, jaki jest obecny status tej technologii? Czy jest już możliwa masowa produkcja takiego mięsa? I drugie pytanie, czy jest jakieś zagrożenie ze strony na przykład monopolizacji takiej produkcji? Czy tylko wielkie firmy byłyby w stanie wtedy produkować mięso? Czy byłyby możliwe produkowanie mięsa przez małych, lokalnych wytwórców też?
Yeah, good question. Sorry, what was the first part of your question? I missed that. Oh, that's all right. The translator's telling me you don't need to. What was the first part of his question? No, he's not. You will need to repeat it.
Jaki jest obecnie status zaawansowania tych technologii? Czy jest możliwa masowa produkcja takiego mięsa?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so currently this is not available commercially. You can't find this in supermarkets or restaurants. There's no cultivated meat has been sold currently. A couple of years ago, one company particularly ambitiously said that they would sell a cultivated meat product by the end of 2018. Of course, that's come and gone, and it didn't happen. And now some of the more ambitious companies in Europe are saying that you might see it by 2021. You know, perhaps we should be a little skeptical of that. When it first comes out, as I said, it's likely to be far more expensive than conventional meat. Perhaps we'll find this in particularly kind of niche, high-end restaurants. The second part of the question was about whether this will lead to kind of centralization of power in the food industry, whether this will be basically dominated by big players or will smaller companies be able to do it. The interesting thing about this industry is many of the CEOs and the heads of the companies are like mission driven. So a lot of them are vegans. And some of these companies are looking at ways of licensing this technology so that other smaller producers are able to use it and to produce cultivated meat as well. You're right, though, there is a kind of concern that this is something that's basically more difficult to do than rearing animals. And the truth is at the moment that we don't really know how that's going to affect the shape of the industry overall.
Ja mam pytanie, bo powiedziałeś, że mięso in vitro ma nie przekonywać ludzi, którzy już są wegetarianami, wegankami, tylko ludzi, którzy jedzą mięso zwierzęce po prostu. I tutaj mnie zastanawia motyw tego, że korporacje, które wytwarzają mięso zwierzęce w tym momencie, inwestują w startupy właśnie w tym sektorze, więc przechodzimy z motywu etycznego na motyw profitu. Więc tu mi przynajmniej wyobraża się, że jednak będzie walka o ludzi, którzy już jedzą, tylko nie jedzą mięsa. I czy widzisz tutaj jakieś zagrożenia?
The guy finished translating ages ago. I was just thinking. Yeah, so the question was about, given that there's now investments from conventional meat producers and it kind of becomes profit-driven and so on, could that squeeze out some of the ethical benefits that I've been speaking about? Is that right? Yeah, so I think on this point, it's not the companies who are killing loads of animals in order to give us meat are bad because they're driven by profits. It's that they're bad because they're killing the loads of animals. So in my view, it's okay for them to be driven by profits, and indeed companies can be driven by profits in order to produce better, more effective, cheaper cultivated meat. And that will be okay. So I'm quite a consequentialist in that respect. I think that what matters is the outcome in terms of the animal suffering. And if we can get to a system where we can circumvent and avoid that animal suffering, then that would be a good thing.
There are also companies working with fish, like finless foods, I think. I don't know if you did some surveys comparing cultured meat versus cultured fish. So how do people or consumers perceive cultured fish? Is it the same as meat?
Interestingly, yes, we do know a little bit about that. There's a couple of different surveys which have asked about different species of animal products. And yeah, both of them agree in terms of the pattern here. It's not quite obvious why this is, but the pattern is basically most people saying that they're interested in cultivated beef, then slightly fewer people saying that they're interested in cultivated pork and cultivated chicken, and then fewer people again saying that they're interested in cultivated fish. And some of these surveys as well have asked about kind of what they call non-traditional meat animal species, horses and cats and dogs and so on, which, you know, almost nobody is interested in those products. So it's not quite clear why that is. But yeah, cultivated beef seems to be the most popular. Pork and chicken a little bit less popular than that, and fish less popular again. But again, we don't really have an explanation for why that might be, to be honest with you. Yeah. I don't know, actually. Well, I do have that data, but I haven't looked at it. Are they interested in cultivated dog meat in China? Yeah, they probably are. I've got that. I'll tell you what, afterwards give me your email address and I'll let you know if they are.
Ja mam takie pytanie. Przedstawiałeś informacje o tym, jak ma wpływ chowu zwierząt na efekt cieplarniany, 20 kilka procent. Moje pytanie brzmi, czy robiłeś badania, czy są takie badania, które porównują zużycie energii, bo jakieś zużycie na pewno jest, przy wyprodukowaniu jednostki mięsa metodą tradycyjną, powiedzmy, obecną w porównaniu do mięsa produkowanego metodą in vitro?
Yes, so the question is about, I've mentioned some of the environmental benefits of cultivated meat compared to conventional animal agriculture, and the gentleman's question is about energy usage specifically. So there's been a number of life cycle analyses where they're comparing different outcomes of cultivated meat production and conventional meat production. All of them agree that in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, land usage and water usage, cultivated meat is more efficient than conventional meat production. As the gentleman points out, energy usage is the one area where cultivated meat is actually more resource intensive than conventional meat. Is that a problem? Only somewhat, I think, is the answer, because a lot of these other things are inevitable outcomes of rearing animals, right? As long as you're stuck with this livestock, you're stuck with their greenhouse gas emissions. Energy usage is something that we can do something about. We can, and indeed we have to, move towards carbon neutral forms of energy production. So in the future, when we're seeing a lot more of our energy coming from renewable sources and zero carbon sources, it will suddenly be less of an issue if we're using more energy, whereas with these other outcomes, land usage and greenhouse gas emissions and so on, that's harder to do something about if we're sticking with animals as the production technique.
Given, or theoretically, if cultivated meat can get to the point where it hits those three boxes you were talking about, like it's tasty, cheaper or cost-effective, and also convenient, is your opinion kind of that cultivated meat is inevitable and consumer acceptance of it is just a matter of like speeding up the process? Because like, you know, every year if 100 or 50 trillion animals are killed, and like each year the faster it comes and the faster it's adopted, then the better it is. Or do you see a future where it's possible that cultivated meat, for some reason, kind of never gets to mass adoption?
Yeah, good question. I have to say that my thinking on that point has kind of changed. A couple of years ago, I probably would have agreed with you that basically the quicker the better. This is an emergency with trillions of animals every year, and you know, if we can do it today, then we ought to. I think that more important than doing it quickly is doing it right. And if it takes another couple of years to go through the regulations effectively and to ensure that we're producing a safe product, that actually might result in fewer animal deaths overall, compared to a situation where we're kind of rushing it through, is perceived as having kind of got through loopholes in regulation, or perhaps ended up kind of with an inferior product that's not able to displace quite so much demand in the future. If there's some kind of scare and there's a setback and it takes 10, 15 years to recover from that, then it will end up worse than it might have been. So yeah, I agree with the sentiment in terms of the urgency of getting this done, but I do think that it's important to get it done right and in a way that will be, I'm with you. I want to displace as much demand as quickly as possible, but that might not be by getting products to market as soon as possible, just because doing it in a safe way and in a way which respects regulation and so on might be more sustainable is not quite the right word, but you know what I'm saying? Less likely to encounter setbacks.
I ostatnie pytanie.
At the World Food Expo in February this year, here in Warsaw, which was an event for the food industry, there was a presentation on cultivated meat, from which I understood that there are a few giants in the market working on developing cultivated meat with funding from large multinational corporations, and that they are going to flood the market with cultivated meat within a few years. And they said that they were going to get the price 3 times below traditional meat price 3 years after introducing it to the market.
Okay.
So what do you think of that? Were they just pitching, or do you think it's possible?
That is not a projection that I've heard, a very optimistic one. I think that there is there has been a lot of hype around the industry. That's not a projection that I've heard, and if you ask any of the cultivated meat experts, when are we going to see these products, everyone's really kind of reluctant to say a date or to commit to anything, because it's most likely they're going to be wrong, basically. I haven't heard that, but I think that would be basically a good thing if we could get the price down that low that quickly. Again, with respect to kind of, is this coming from multinational companies which are funded by industry interests and profit-driven and so on? I don't necessarily think that makes it a bad thing if they are. Of course, the animal products that we have today are similarly profit-driven, and so is pretty much anything that you can buy in the shop, basically. I don't think that makes it a bad thing. I'm kind of skeptical of that timeline, but if that could happen, then that would be a good thing in my view.
Thank you, Chris, for a very interesting lecture. A Państwu dziękuję za uwagę i zapraszam na wieczorne koncerty. Dziękuję.
Thank you very much.